Good morning, everyone. My name is Suzanne Dion with Harmony Place Monterey in beautiful Monterey, California. Harmony Place Monterey is co-directed by Dr. Mark Schwartz and Laura Galperin, who were formerly the directors of the Masters and Johnson's Institute. Harmony Place is a partial hospitalization program as well as intensive outpatient treatment center that specializes in all manner of mental health disorders, addictive disorders, and trauma recovery. This morning, we have Samantha Young, who'll be presenting psychotherapy for trauma. So now I'd like to introduce Samantha, who has worked as a therapist for over 16 years, specializing in the treatment of trauma, dissociative disorders, and eating disorders. Samantha's background includes working with abused and neglected children, working with adults who have experienced severe neglect and trauma, as well as complex PTSD, military personnel, and individuals struggling with co-occurring disorders, including substance abuse and eating disorders. Samantha initially earned a Bachelor's of Science in Psychology from Missouri Baptist University and then a Master's of Science degree in Counseling from Missouri Baptist University in St. Louis, Missouri. She was trained by the EMDR Institute in St. Louis, Missouri in EMDR and is trained in internal family systems therapy, clinical hypnosis, cognitive behavioral therapy, and dialectical behavioral therapy, and is currently a licensed professional clinical counselor in the state of California. Samantha is passionate and driven to help individuals become their most authentic selves through compassion and caring, and believes in taking an approach that takes into account the entirety of an individual mind, body, and soul. She believes in bringing dignity, respect, and a therapeutic alliance into the therapeutic relationship in order to facilitate healing. Samantha, welcome. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you. So nice to be here with everyone. All right. So thank you everyone so much for joining me. I like to kind of talk about trauma treatment. I'd like to develop the structure of it. So I like to define kind of what we're looking at and where we're going along the way and where we might get stuck. So to begin, I like to define what is trauma. And so with that, so trauma might be anything that might overwhelm our ability to cope or respond, especially if we perceive that our lives, our physical, spiritual, or emotional self is at risk. And that's kind of a pretty broad term. I like to think about with trauma that it's something that an individual is just not prepared for in that moment. So it really might overwhelm whatever capacities they have. So if I'm a little small child and I can't function or do much on my own, then I don't have a lot of capacity. So if something happens and the adults or older individuals around me are unable to regulate that, then I'm responsible for regulating that. And so that really kind of overwhelms the capacities of that individual. One of the quotes that I really like that kind of sums up what trauma is and kind of the impact that trauma has is by Holly Byrne. Trauma is all or nothing, a tsunami wave of destruction, a tornado of unimaginable awfulness that whooshes into your life and wreaks such havoc that in just an instant, your whole world will never be the same again. And if we think about it in that way, as this natural disaster, for anyone that's experienced or seen the aftermath of a natural disaster, it just kind of decimates the entire landscape of everything. So also kind of some more definitions about what trauma is. So it's unique to an individual. It might be something that happens as a one-time event, or it can be a series of events that an individual has experienced over time. And it really kind of mars the individual's ability to integrate their emotional experience. As we are impacted by trauma, it's kind of whole body. So it impacts our emotions, it impacts our physical being, it impacts our spiritual being, and the individual may experience things subjectively that they view as being a threat to their life or to their body or even to their sanity. So I like to kind of, like I said, kind of set the framework for what trauma is. So in kind of this overview of trauma, traditionally there have been two types of trauma. And the first one that we focus on is type 1 trauma, what used to be called little t trauma. And with that, this traditionally was a single incident. So maybe this is something that has happened once. It happened out of the blue. There kind of wasn't any preparation or planning for it. To outside individuals, this may be something that seems insignificant, in nature, but may actually be kind of distressing to the individual, and it's definitely going to have an impact on the individual. So with these, I kind of list out some of the common ones. This is by no means comprehensive, but some of this may include traumatic accidents. So if you think of something like, let's say, a motor vehicle accident, that can actually be traumatic for an individual. If I experience a motor vehicle accident, it kind of shakes whatever world I'm in at that point in time. After that, I might be pretty fearful of going back into a car, being around people. I might have a lot of difficulties with kind of just reorienting myself. Obviously, as kind of we just talked about, natural disasters are a major one as well. A terrorist attack, that's something that really, as individuals, like we all experienced on 9/11, that can both be a little T trauma and a big T trauma. You can't prepare for that. No one kind of knew that that was going to happen in that way. It could also be witnessing violence. So if I'm in an environment and I'm witnessing violence enacted on another individual, that is also really difficult because it also alters my sense of what is normative. And so with that, that can also create difficulty, obviously. So intermittent neglect or isolation, and I think sometimes people really don't think of this so much as being traumatic, but if from, let's say, an early age, if I'm neglected, I don't learn the normal rhythms of being with other human beings. I don't learn how to be able to soothe myself or regulate myself in any capacity. Verbal abuse, criticism, and kind of with criticism, I would say that's more enduring criticism. It could be being bullied or teased. We frequently here at Harmony Place see a lot of individuals who had severe bullying when they were younger, and they don't necessarily classify that as something that is difficult or bad, and yet it alters their landscape. It really changes how they respond to people and what that happens with that. If an individual's feelings are continuously dismissed, so I don't then know that or learn that I can trust myself if I say that the sky is blue and everyone else around me tells me that it's purple, then I come to learn that the sky is purple because I can't trust myself or my feelings and it's not validated in some way. Another thing that is not included on this slide might be things like divorce or kind of difficult conflictual relationships within the family of origin. If I'm being shuttled back and forth from one household to the other, that creates trauma and chaos, and there's not kind of this sense of cohesiveness. So those are kind of just some examples of what we would term little t trauma or type 1 trauma. Okay, so then the next one, type 2 trauma, big T trauma. And I think that this is most frequently what people think of when they think of what is trauma. With type 2 trauma, it can be complex and repetitive in nature. It's also probably chronic, so it's happening generally more than once. It's not kind of this single incident that happens. It may involve harm or abandonment. And again, abandonment can be just as critical as the actual harm that occurs. Because if I'm abandoned, let's say when I'm younger, then again, I don't learn those normal rhythms with being with other human beings and how to regulate myself. And so that becomes damaging both in that moment and later on as I'm trying to develop and grow and evolve. It might involve serious bodily injury, also life-threatening experiences. There might be periods of time when an individual really fears for their life. And because of that, again, it alters things, it alters our physiology. So some examples of this include verbal, physical, or sexual abuse. Those are kind of the common ones I think that we think about when we hear trauma. Domestic violence, community violence. So growing up in a really chaotic, violent environment actually has an impact on an individual, even if they're not the one that is directly involved. Because again, it threatens the sense of safety of an individual. Obviously, witnessing war or violence. A lot of the military clients that I work with have been in different types of situations where they might have been involved in actually enacting harm in some way, or they might have been a witness to what was going on with the cultures that they were working with. And that leaves an impact because it colors the way that you view the world. Genocide, severe neglect. Let's see here. So it also might include, I think, a lot of cultural things. So within one's culture, being disowned from one's culture, that also alters the way in which an individual views the world. So again, the two basic kind of trauma, type 1, type 2, big T, little t trauma. So again, kind of having that basis of understanding what trauma actually is. So as we talk about what trauma actually is, we want to talk about things that contribute to either creating this buffer for the individual or to not having that basic foundation that could protect them from some of these things. And there's a lot of research on attachment. There's a lot of newer things that have been happening in the field of attachment. And I'm not going to go over all of those today, but I just wanted to cover some of the really kind of basics of attachment. So the first one, attachment, human emotional development is linked with emotional regulation and right brain development. The attachment status between child and parent reflects the ability to regulate intense affective experience while simultaneously maintaining mutual connection. This solidifies the attachment bond. So if we think about this, it's actually really crucial for a child to attach to someone or something. And the someone is actually really important because by virtue of that relationship with that individual, I then learn how to regulate or not regulate. So if there's something that's overwhelming my capacities, like if I'm a 2 or 3-year-old and I don't quite yet know everything about emotions or how to share or how to do certain things, then I need someone else that's going to help kind of guide and lead me. So if I don't have that, if I have someone who is dysregulated themselves and has never learned that, then there's not a lot of safety there because I don't learn the basic tenets of how to be able to actually kind of vacillate back and forth between, okay, I can experience this emotion, and if I don't know what to do with it, there's a safety net under me. So kind of attachment, it's really crucial for us to be able to develop and maintain that, especially for our emotional experiences. The second one here, security of attachment leads to an expanded range of exploration. Fear constricts, safety expands. So the more fearful or overwhelming an experience an individual has, the smaller their world becomes. It becomes unsafe to risk, unsafe to be able to connect with others, and unsafe to explore. And if we think about that, and what we want as human beings, if our world has become so small and so isolated, things outside of that small world are really terrifying. And so what we want to think about when we're thinking about treating trauma and working with individuals is what kind of contributed to that fear? What is still making their world really, really small? And how can we help expand that gradually? So fear constricts, safety expands. The next one, the caregiver's affective competence is crucial as it helps the child's sense of security and helps the child understand themselves, others, in the world. It helps the child to be able to deal with stressful situations that are beyond their resources to manage. So again, if we think about this, if mom or dad or caregiver knows how to navigate the world, they help me to feel comfortable to navigate the world. If they don't know how to navigate the world and people are scary or terrifying in some way, then I learn that people are scary or terrifying, and that's what I take in as a little being. So being able to reflect on emotional experience, both one's own and others, has been shown to interrupt the intergenerational transmission of psychopathology and to promote resilience under stress. So again, key things. So if I'm able to have some of these basic components, then I'm able to more withstand things that come along in life for me. So, okay, so trauma, what's the impact? So again, I like to really look at how is an individual affected by this? I like to be able to understand where they've been, what they're going through, so I know how to formulate treatment. So I know what to focus on or what may be less crucial to focus on. And I really think that for each individual, this has to be a process that's kind of brand new for each person. It can't be one approach to every single individual. So again, kind of focusing on the impact. The brains of children who are exposed to trauma and stress are wired differently than children whose experiences have been more secure. When experiencing stress or threat, the brain's fight or flight response is activated through an increased production of cortisol. This can either be protective in emergency. So if we think about this, I use this example with my clients a lot. Like if an angry tiger came in the room, it's actually really useful for that cortisol to be happening so that I can actually react. And my brain doesn't have to think of, oh, is this a safe tiger or is this a tiger that's going to eat my face off? And so it can actually be really protective in emergencies, but in situations of chronic stress where the cortisol stays really high, the level then becomes toxic and it actually damages or kills neurons in those critical parts of the brain. So actually huge impact that trauma can have on our brains. Children are especially more susceptible to PTSD because in most situations they're helpless or they're incapable of leaving that situation. So they can't generally fight, they can't generally flee. So in an inescapable situation, we have to do something as a human being if we're even a little being, because it's intolerable to do nothing. And so with that, an individual is actually just trying to figure out strategies to adapt or survive when that's happening. So if I feel helpless, it feels like I can't exert power or control over my environment in a way that is going to make any changes. And so let's see here. So I just wanted to go back to also kind of the inability to be able to kind of see things as dangerous, like the changing of the child's brain. So certain red flags don't trigger themselves. So it's like, if I'm in a situation that I've been in 10 times before, and maybe it's an abusive situation, I don't then register that situation later on in life as a red flag. So I might wind up repeating different patterns throughout. So you might see this in alcoholic families. So in an alcoholic family, an individual may say to themselves, I'm never going to like marry an alcoholic. I'm never going to, put myself in that situation. And inevitably, they either wind up with someone who has the characteristics of an alcoholic or someone who is an alcoholic, because those patterns are familiar and they don't raise red flags for an individual. Okay. So just kind of continuing again to talk about what's the impact of trauma. So again, we kind of talked about what the brain is doing, and certain neurotransmitters are protective, and they can serve as emotional buffers and can help an individual to regulate the intensity of their feelings. Without this buffer, it leaves an individual with difficulty with being able to regulate those feelings more normatively. And if you think about this for yourself, anytime that you've actually been really, really overwhelmed, everything probably feels really, really high. And if there was nothing to bring that back down eventually, that would feel pretty dysregulating for you. And frequently, with survivors of trauma, they're at this stage relatively often, okay? So an individual can also be robbed of their sense of safety, the belief that they can trust others, or that they can even trust their own judgment or intuition. If you can't trust your own judgment or intuition, that leaves you kind of vulnerable and exposed in the world. So I can't then make a decision and be able to regroup or be able to change that if I don't even trust that I have that ability to make that decision. So that also really damages an individual's self-esteem as well. Okay. So just kind of an overview still. So some of the things that without the protection of these neurotransmitters that individuals may be prone to, clinical depression. We see that pretty frequently with PTSD and trauma. We also see individuals that have a lot of difficulty with modulating their emotions. So their emotions may go super high, super low. They might have explosive outbursts. They have the hypervigilance, which includes the startle response. So they may be easily overwhelmed by changes in situations. If I'm late for a session, that throws off how safe they might feel. If they hear a loud noise and it's in a new environment or even in an environment they've been in, it kind of creates that element of that they can't feel safe. There's this sense of learned helplessness. I can't exert control over anything. So those are some of the ones. And then what I like to do is break it down into different categories of what has been the impact. So relationally. So why is it important to look at the impact relationally for an individual who's experienced trauma? I really feel like it informs how the individual functions both with themselves and others. If the individual can't turn to others, the rupture that was originally created as a result of the trauma actually doesn't have the opportunity to heal. People are both at times the source of the pain as well as the cure for healing. So with relational, the individual may present to us with having difficulties with feeling love or trust in relationships. And so they may not initially engage in therapy. They might be withdrawn. They might be a little slower to trust in their relationship. They might have a decreased interest in sexual activities or in activities that involve other people, which would include some of the emotional distancing from others. So they would distance themselves from others. You might see this, they might isolate themselves a lot. They might actually have a lot of anxiety that also goes along with this. Their relationships might be tumultuous in some ways and characterized by anger or mistrust, or they might just overall have a lot of difficulty with even being able to maintain relationships. So maybe they go from one relationship to another, or maybe they stay in relationships for a really long time that might have some qualities that may not be the healthiest because they've kind of grown comfortable with the individual and it's really scary to start again with someone. Okay, so then spiritual. With spiritual, I really feel like spiritually this gets overlooked. Like when an individual experiences trauma, I don't know that it's kind of the natural response to look at the spiritual impact that it's had on the individual. But spirituality and faith are actually crucially important to healing because again, they involve that cure for healing. They involve people. They involve communities. With this, with spirituality and faith, individuals are really attempting to be able to seek meaning, have a purpose and a direction in life. And spirituality and faith plays this role quite well. And it actually helps people to cope and it helps to protect them from stress, as well as there is a group norm that normally goes on with a spiritual community or faith-based community, which helps to facilitate healing. In natural disasters, a lot of resources will be put towards actually churches or other community organizations that draw people in. So I believe that it's really, really important to actually, for an individual, find out for them, what was it like before the trauma spiritually? And what is their belief? What is their faith currently now after that's happened? So in the spiritual realm with what I have listed here, feeling that their life has little purpose and meaning after a trauma has occurred. If I believe in God and something happens, there's a natural inclination to blame God, to feel like, you know, there must be something bad or wrong or defective about me, or God hates me, or things like that, questioning the presence of God or the spiritual being that other individuals have, questioning one's purpose. And ultimately, this leaves us feeling really disconnected from the world. So again, I think that looking at and questioning and at least talking about the impact that it's had on their spirituality is vastly important in treating the individual as a whole human being. Okay. So next one is physical. And physical is probably the one that most of us are really familiar with. With trauma, individuals really come into us sometimes with a lot of chronic symptoms. They might have chronic diseases. They might be fairly somatic in nature. Depression really presents physically a lot of times. Individuals will be fatigued or lethargic or not feel well. They'll have a lot of difficulty with functioning on a basic level. So they're not eating, they're not sleeping in a normative way. And then this leads into, you know, not having the healthiest self that they could. And so chronic diseases, it lowers their quality of life. Okay. And then cognitive. So cognitive, another common one. So cognitive and emotional, which is listed on the next slide. These are the ones I think that most people think of when they think of the impact that stress and trauma have on an individual. Individuals will have a lot of difficulty remembering things, and it could be day-to-day things. So it could be that I don't have the mental energy to clean the house. I don't have the mental energy to interact with other human beings. So my work or my job might be affected if I'm unable to do that. I might lose relationships as a result of really not wanting to put in or having the energy to put in attention and focus with that. There might, at the kind of more extreme levels, be losses of time. So a whole day may go on and I may not remember components of it. My mind might be flooded with other things. So if I'm in the height of trauma and re-experiencing things, I'm not really paying attention to little day-to-day things. My brain is kind of tunnel vision focused. And so a lot of difficulties with that, a lot of difficulties with concentration, frequently easily distracted. And so with emotional depression, like we've previously mentioned, a lot of feelings of helplessness and hopelessness and a sense of despair. So if I feel a sense of despair again, it kind of goes back to, I don't really feel like I can impact the world or that I have control over whether good or bad things actually happen to me. Feelings of guilt and shame. And with shame, I'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. But looking at shame for an individual is actually really, really crucial. Really understanding where they carry that and how that impacts their everyday life. That kind of goes along with feeling damaged. When an individual feels shame, it's frequently feeling bad, wrong, defective for the most part. There might be a lot of compulsive and obsessive behaviors that also go on for an individual. So you might see this pretty frequently. Individuals, let's say with eating disorders, might use food in a compulsive way. They're using it as a kind of means of regulation. They might be obsessively cleaning the house after they've had a particularly difficult traumatic day or session. They'll go home and do something that focuses their mind in a different way. And again, like that, with the feeling out of control, it helps to exert some sense of control over their world, even if it's in some really small way. And they might also feel numb, which we'll talk about when we talk about the stages of trauma and kind of how to treat that. There's numbing and intrusion. So sometimes an individual feels really numb with what's going on in their world. Okay. And then I always like to think about, for an individual, I like to see some of the means that they've used as being protective in nature. For whatever reason, those things that they use that we might now see as being maladaptive helped them in some way, shape, or form in the beginning. And it might have been the only thing that they had the ability to actually be able to do. And so I like to honor that. I like to really tread lightly on that in the beginning until I really understand why they're using it and what maintains it. And I don't like to take something away before they have something else in place. So I list out kind of some of the common things that survivors have used and how this might present inside the therapy room or in our groups or in outside relationships. So the first one here is minimizing. So pretending that whatever happened was not really that bad. This is highly protective in the beginning. Like if there's something going on in my household, if I'm getting physically abused every day and I have to go to school, it's two different worlds that I have to live in. And so there's protection in minimizing that something either didn't happen or wasn't really that bad. If somebody asks me about a bruise, I ran into something, and I don't have to then kind of feel that conflictual nature. I may not even know that what's going on is necessarily bad at the time if I'm a child. So minimizing is actually really highly protective in nature in the beginning that becomes really dysfunctional later on. So then rationalizing, explaining away what happened. Yeah, my parents, they had a rough life, and so, they kind of did the best that they could. And whereas that's true in a lot of circumstances, we do the best that we can with what we have. There are some things above and beyond that. So if your parent is beating you every day, what they went through and doing the best that they can, it's still harmful that they're beating you every day. But you can't kind of go right into breaking that down because you don't know what it's protecting for the individual by them rationalizing it. So I like to explore, what was that like? Like, this was going on and you felt this way, and yet, there's this protection here. What does that feel like for you? And frequently in the later stages of therapy, it's really polarizing for an individual and they can see that. But in the beginning, not necessarily so. So denying, I feel like that's pretty self-explanatory. Forgetting. So individuals, memory's fallible. And so individuals really don't have all of the pieces to the puzzle sometimes. Sometimes they don't have all of the context of what happened. And sometimes they get more of that as you go along. So there might be things that they kind of look at in terms of like, oh, I never looked at these generational patterns in my family and how this might have contributed to the way that I do things that's not working for me necessarily, or that was damaging in nature, but it's kind of that putting together process that might come later on. Splitting, believing that the events happened to someone else. You'll see this a lot in individuals who struggle with a lot of dissociation or dissociative disorders. If it happened to someone else, then it's a lot easier to kind of metabolize. I don't have to, it doesn't sink into me as an individual. If it's happened to someone else, I can put that at a distance. I can put that at arm's length, and it doesn't have the same impact. But when I put everything together, it actually can feel crushing in some way that all of those things happen to me and not kind of separate pieces of me. Okay? Leaving the body, leaving or numbing one's body. If I'm in a situation where I cannot physically escape, leaving my body, going away into my mind is actually highly protective in nature. And there are times that we all normally do this, and sometimes it's more conscious than other times. So if I'm daydreaming because I'm in a meeting and my mind is wandering somewhere, it's not dangerous necessarily. My attention just focuses. And yet leaving your body, actually, if I'm not aware of any of the sensory things that are going on around me, that's protective. If harmful things are happening to me, I'm being abused or hurt in some way. But in the normative world, if those things were not going on, it's actually quite dangerous. If you think about it, if we're not in our body and we're in the middle of traffic, that can be really dangerous. If you're driving your car and you've kind of left your body, you're still there in your car, but you're not fully engaged. So it becomes maladaptive in the future, but in the beginning, it was actually pretty protective. Like individuals will describe that they went somewhere else. Maybe they went someplace in their mind, maybe they looked at the ceiling, maybe they just went somewhere else, and that helped to protect them at the time. Okay, so control. I think control is a big one that I see frequently in trauma treatment, both in subtle ways and in major ways. So it really helps the individual in the beginning to keep their life and their environment in some sense of order, and to actually exert some control over something that previously was really uncontrollable for them. So with that, there might be things that they're still doing to keep things massively in control. So eating disorder clients, they might be controlling their portions of food down to the minute crumb of weighing it out or measuring it. They may be eating at certain intervals where they have to eat at a specific time. They have to eat at 6 o'clock. And if they don't eat at 6 o'clock, it causes a lot of internal stress for them. So I like to really also explore in what ways is control still coming up for them, and how might that inform your work? Like, where do they still not feel safe or okay that they're still having to exert control over it? It could even be in the therapeutic relationship. So again, like if I'm late, or if I'm appear to be looking a certain way in session, that the client might then attribute to me being bored, or me not being engaged with them in the normal way that I'm engaged with them, they're going to want to exert some control. Some clients may get upset about that, and they may tell you directly or indirectly. They may, be silent in the next session. And, if you're checking in with them, they may say, I really feel the common one that sometimes comes up in my work is people might say, are you mad at me? And the answer is generally, no, I'm not. But when they ask, am I mad at them? Like, I want to also, for myself, like, know that that's not the case. I want to check in with myself and know that that's not the case. And if that's not the case, I try and inquire further on, no, I'm not mad at you, but kind of what is bringing that up for you? What's leading you to believe that that might be going on? And normally they'll say like, you're not kind of engaging with me in the same way that you engage with me normally, or you seem XYZ. And it might be on a day when I'm tired, or I don't feel well, or things like that. And they're picking that up. And so I don't want to discount that something is going on and that there's some reality to that. And then, yes, I don't want to give too much information. So let's say if I'm not feeling well that day, I'll say like, actually, you know, I'm actually not feeling all that well, but I'm okay. But no, I'm not angry at you. And then that kind of repairs the bond a little bit too, because I'm not I'm not discounting what they're picking up, and I'm actually validating it and helping them validate their own experience so that they then learn, both in our therapeutic relationship and in outside relationships, to learn to trust themselves a little bit more and at least to ask the question about if they sense something's going on. So control can really show up in a lot of different ways. Chaos. So frequently, I will have a lot of individuals who can thrive really well in a crisis or in a chaotic environment. And so if things are really, really calm, or if they're not constantly going or taking care of others, they don't really know how to focus in any other way. They don't know how to be calm. They don't know who they are outside of that relationship. And so we'll see this when we are trying to teach individuals coping and calming skills. Frequently, it will be intolerable to be in their bodies and to not be in that chaotic environment. They might manage our community here, so they're really great with like taking care of others and running around and doing things, but they can't be with themselves and they can't be internal in a way that's not chaotic. And if you think about it and how that could have been protective, um, if there was something major going on, if I lived in a household that generally didn't notice much and was pretty dismissive, if there was something out of control, like it forces others to respond. It has to be pretty extreme to get others to respond sometimes. So spacing out kind of pretty similar to leaving the body. It allows our focus to just shift somewhere else. And what we want to be able to eventually do is give individuals the capacity to do this with choice. So I'm choosing to like not be present in this way right now because I need a break, versus it's automatic where it's happening to me versus something that I'm actively doing. Okay. And then, you know, continue on to the next slide, a few other ones, again, how individuals might have coped. Hypervigilance. This is classic PTSD. If I'm tuning into every aspect of my environment, then ostensibly I can't be caught off guard. I'm going to be aware of everything that happens at every time. So I'll frequently have clients who, if they're in an outside environment, let's say they're sitting in a restaurant and they can see the door or they can see traffic, they will know the number of people that pass by, how many people are in that car. They will know minute details that if an individual didn't have trauma and wasn't focused on that, they wouldn't know. So it's in an attempt, again, to keep themselves safe. So if something were happening to me with childhood trauma or trauma in general, that would be safe. Like if I had to know the exact moment someone came home and, you know, I had to gauge their mood, so I had to know what their facial expressions were and what their bodily cues were, then that's protective because maybe I can then navigate that and keep myself safe. But it eventually turns into something that's maladaptive because an individual can never rest. You can't put your guard down when you're hypervigilant in that capacity. Okay. So next one here, humor. Humor is generally one of the, I think, subtler ones that people really don't think about confronting somewhat in therapy and understanding how it might be serving to protect the individual. Clients may be really entertaining, and we like to be entertained as human beings. And so if they're telling jokes or stories or they're just engaging or entertaining, it might be really easy to just kind of go along with that in some ways. And I put on here, if you keep people laughing, you maintain distance. Like at least then, if I keep you laughing and entertained in some way, then I know that you may not be dangerous. Like if you feel fondly towards me, you may not represent danger. So it's definitely a protective strategy. Busyness. So again, another way to really keep us from being in the present. If I'm compulsively working, if I'm doing everything for everybody else, it really doesn't give me the opportunity to have feelings come up, and I don't have to manage those because I'm just going. I'm a human doing versus a human being. And when we actually are trying to teach individuals to practice that, it's actually really difficult for them to do. They have to like force themselves to not be doing multiple things at once. Escape. So it's a natural human mechanism. When something is happening, we want to be able to escape. Some people do this in their minds. They might have fantasy worlds. They might have relationships that are not reciprocal, that actually kind of help them to escape in some way. And so we want to find out, like, okay, what are the reasons that an individual still needs to escape? And in what ways are they doing it? And does this still serve them or not? Or is this harmful in some way? And self-harm, I feel like, again, this is a common one that most people focus on as well. With self-harm, for the individual, it's a way to control pain and have a release. If I'm able to control what happens to me, at least I know what's happening. And at least it's not going to be some shock or surprise, but I control it versus someone else doing it to me. And then if someone else does it to me, it doesn't hurt as much, or I'm already desensitized to it in some way. And there are multiple forms of self-harm we'll get into when we talk about some of the behaviors that are associated with these things. Okay. So common behaviors. So with common behaviors, I listed out just some real basic ones that I see pretty frequently. And normally survivors will have more than one. Sometimes they'll have two, or sometimes they'll have three. And sometimes they'll switch. So if somebody comes into my office with an eating disorder and let's say substance abuse, there are going to be periods of time when one is higher than the other. So if they're using their eating disorder, if we're working on their eating disorder and they're getting some abstinence from their eating disorder, all of a sudden they may have urges to use. Their cravings may be super high. And so I want to be looking at what is the potential for like any history of addictive behavior. So if they've experienced it in the past, when we're actually working on the stuff that maybe caused them to have these addictions or like need these addictions, it's going to come up. And so I try to have some anticipatory guidance around that, both myself and with the client. And so even if they're like, yeah, I haven't used substances in like 6 months, I like to preemptively set the framework with them of, okay, that may be the case, but what I want to help you do is figure out how can we put things in place where you're going to be able to have those prior to actually needing those. So, so addictions, gambling, compulsive spending, these are kind of more subtle things that we may not think of as common behaviors, but again, they're things that if we've taken away kind of the heavy hitters, then these things come up. They're all of a sudden having financial difficulties because they're compulsively spending, or they're gambling, or they're spending their money on just different things that it's to fill that void that the other maladaptive behaviors were filling, but now they don't have. Okay. So self-harming behaviors. So self-harming behaviors, I feel like is broader than kind of what is listed here. But with that, kind of some of the common ones are cutting, burning, and hitting oneself. I would also add to the list of self-harming behaviors, sometimes people sexually harm themselves. So there might be things that they're doing to punish themselves sexually if they've experienced trauma, as they view themselves as bad, wrong, defective. Cutting, sometimes it's pretty self-evident. They might have the wounds on them. They might still have the need to let others know that they're hurting in some way. Burning behaviors and the hitting, I find those to be a little bit more secretive sometimes. An individual may not disclose those initially. I'm generally checking in throughout their treatment about, you know, what are the things that they're struggling with? What's going on that maybe we haven't talked about? Or how are you actually coping with some of these things, these high stress, these high emotions? And sexual, again, there might be reenactment that's happening. They may be acting out sexually, again, to have some sense of control. So again, if I'm controlling the sexual encounters that are happening to me and I've had sexual abuse, then it's in my control and it's not something that's happening to me per se. And that kind of, again, I kind of touched on the harming oneself through the sexual interactions. So you want to just know, for an individual, you're kind of excavating, like, what is it that got you to where you are right now? And not in a judgmental stance, not in a way that's negative. I like to really understand, what is the function of this? Like, how has this served you? Let's celebrate how this has served you, but let's also look at how you might want to change this, or well, what other things we can try out, and that it's not going to work. In my relapse prevention groups, I teach clients, like, look, this is not going to have the same charge in the beginning. You're going to use this and you're going to say it didn't work. It did not completely take away whatever I was using before to take it away. And I would tell them, you're right. It's not going to immediately take it away. You have to practice it. You have to have other tools in your toolbox to be able to get this to work, to wear in new pathways in your brain versus the old pathways that you're used to going down. So it does take a bit of practice, which normally, again, like, it's that wanting that release, wanting that quick fix, which who wouldn't want a release when you're actually in pain. Okay. So again, just outlining, all right, what happens in different stages of trauma? So we talked about the impact, we talked about what is trauma. So these are kind of the phases that an individual may go through. I just kind of have a little graphic there about some of the things and some of the pressures of PTSD and how overwhelming that can actually be for an individual. So stages 1, 2, 3. So stage 1 is hyperarousal, stage 2 is re-experiencing phase, and stage 3 is the numbing phase. So we're going to talk about each individually here. Okay. So the first stage, the hyperarousal phase. And during this time, an individual's physiology is in high gear and has been impacted by the psychological impact of what happened and is not able to reset independently. So some of the symptoms are listed below that occur in that stage: difficulty sleeping, concentrating, being easily startled, irritability, anger, agitation, panic, hypervigilance, abdominal distress, hot flashes, chills, and frequent urination. So in this phase, I like analogies. And so I like to think of it as a snow globe that's been shaken up. And if we think of a snow globe, everything in that snow globe is out of sorts and all over the place, and you really can't see anything clearly, and you're surrounded by the fallout. So that's kind of what's happening in this hyperarousal phase. Like, everything is really high, everything is all over the place, and sometimes this goes back and forth. So an individual may come in a more numbing phase, and it may go into a different phase at times. So it's not that it happens 1, 2, 3. They can kind of be interchangeable. So phase 1, snow globe, everything has been shaken up. So it's really actually pretty confusing at this phase for an individual. Okay, so re-experiencing phase. So in this phase, just similar to the hyperarousal phase, an individual may be struggling with actually re-experiencing the trauma. So they may be having intrusive imagery and reliving the trauma. And sometimes we don't know unless we ask. So I'm always, especially in the beginning phases, I'm always talking about the basics. How are you sleeping? How's your food intake? What are you doing to soothe yourself? Like, what are your basics? So if I'm building a house and my foundation is faulty, then the rest of what I build that on is faulty. And so I want to make sure an individual has those basics. So some symptoms during this stage, again, they're having the intrusive memories that at this point, it's really outside of their control. So they might be having nightmares that seemingly come up out of nowhere and are pretty distressing. They might be having body memories. And so sometimes an individual, one, won't know what these are, and two, won't discuss them because they might be shameful in nature. So if I'm experiencing things in my genital region because I've had sexual trauma, and that's occurring pretty frequently where I'm having pain or body memories in that area, I don't generally bring it up. And so I want to kind of have that in the back of my mind and be thinking about that as an individual might be going through this phase. They might also be having exaggerated reactions to reminders of the event. So I see this very frequently in a lot of clients, but also in my military clients. And so my military clients, there's an anniversary of something coming up. It might be an anniversary of when one of their buddies was killed, or an anniversary of a massive event that changed their lives or their buddies' lives, or it might even be time of year. So sometimes as it gets closer to time of year, these symptoms go up for an individual. So they may become more depressed and more withdrawn. They might be more irritable. They might be experiencing more in their body. And so I kind of want to have an understanding of time frame that things occurred in, to know and anticipate and help them anticipate what's going to be different times of year sometimes. Okay. So the numbing stage. So in this stage, the individual might feel robotic or be on autopilot, might be disconnected from feelings. So they may be able to talk about the events as if they were just talking about going to the grocery store or telling a story. And whereas that might seem positive in some ways, it actually can be destructive if they're not connecting the feelings with what's happened at a point. It still is making the trauma still impact them in some way. So during the numbing stage, the ability to shut off emotions during the traumatic event is often essential for the individual to be able to put aside his or her own feelings, as these would be too overwhelming to experience in the moment. So again, I'm celebrating the fact that, look, you have this mechanism. Every human being has this mechanism to shut off emotions. And you did it, and it was protective for you. But you have trouble in your relationships right now. And let's talk about maybe how that's not serving you, or what gets in the way of having feelings. So symptoms during this stage include loss of interest in life and other people. They might be pretty isolative. They might feel really detached or estranged from others and from the world. You see them withdrawing a lot. So maybe they're telling you, they come into you on a Monday and they say, I spent all weekend in my room and I didn't really have contact with another human being, which contributes then to making the symptom worse. Again, people are both sometimes the difficulty and the cure. And so they are also going to have avoidance of thoughts and feelings that might be associated with a traumatic event. So they may not be going to places that they normally go to, because if they do, it's going to bring those things up, and they're in this numbing phase that is serving to shut everything down. So again, just being curious and like understanding and knowing some of these things I find important. Okay. And so now the stages of trauma treatment. So let's talk a little bit about what do we do in these three stages. So again, we define this a little bit of the three stages, and this has been around for a while and it still works. And there are some changes and some shifts that we can do in each of these stages, but I still kind of see this as a good model. So the first is stabilization. Then there's the integration and processing of the traumatic memories, and integration and meaning-making phases. Okay. So stages of trauma treatment, stabilization. So during this stage, there's a focus on stabilizing behaviors, creating safety, reducing the traumatic symptoms, skill building, and development of the overall treatment. I like to really think of this as creating a template for the therapeutic process. And I know that seems pretty basic, but again, the basics I feel are really important to informing the treatment and what we do then in the rest of the work. So with that, this sets the stage for pacing, which is actually really important, and what is going to individually be needed for the client. So pacing throughout trauma treatment is something that doesn't always get talked about. Essentially, as the clinician, it's my job to be able to pace it. Sometimes it's going to go faster, sometimes it's going to go slower. But I also have to know what's going on with the individual to actually handle the pacing in an appropriate way. So let's talk about some of the goals in this stage. So in this stage, history taking seems pretty basic, but I think of history taking as your GPS. So it's a roadmap of where an individual has been, where they may be going, and where they may be getting detoured along the way. a GPS kind of gives us step-by-step directions. And so it keeps us incrementally going along. It alerts us if there are delays or detours. And sometimes it suggests a different route. Sometimes we take that route, sometimes we don't. So I really see it, this phase and the history is really our GPS and our roadmap. So in the history taking, I'm constantly thinking about this. I obviously do an initial history, as do most of you. I'm constantly thinking about what happened. Okay, why are they here? What are the major transitions or the minor transitions in a person's life? Like, how are they interacting and dealing with people and relationships and self-concepts? So what are some of the ways that they've coped? What is the function of the symptoms? So in the history taking, let's say for an eating disorder client, I really am curious and want to know what is the function of their eating disorder. So I might do this early on or later. I might have them write about what's the function of your eating disorder. Tell me what its job is. Like, what do you understand its purpose to be? And sometimes they'll say they don't know, but normally they know. There's something, they're like, well, it helps me to not feel. It helps me to numb out. It helps me to, not have expectations placed on me to be in a relationship because I have these difficulties. And so it's really important to understand the function of the system. So building a therapeutic alliance, again, foundation. So I'm discussing with the client, what is the framework of the treatment going to look like? What can they expect? Anticipatory guidance. So what can you expect from me? What are my expectations of you? What are your expectations of the work? Here's what I know and understand about the work, and let's talk about if it goes too fast or slow, the pacing. An individual may want to just dive right in and get it over with. And I'll explain to them that process, and sometimes that's okay, but sometimes it might be re-traumatizing to them, and so we want to talk about what might be the best way to go about that. So we're really trying to give them a way. They're going to struggle, but we want them to be able to do it productively. I don't want to flood them in a way that they're not ready for, that they don't feel capable for, because that's ultimately going to impair the work later on down the road. Okay, so at this stage, also just being able to build that foundation with skills. So I'm having them practice it and practice like trying that on. So we're doing things like safe place work. And there's some really good resources for safe place imagery. And a lot of what we do here at Harmony Place, and I do in my individual work, is to help an individual create a safe place. And so we'll take them through that in the session, but we'll also have them do things like draw that, like write about what it's like to be in that safe place. Practice going to that safe place like 15, 20 minutes a day. We'll have them be doing things like safe sleep routines. So if an individual is experiencing nightmares every day or terror when they go to sleep, that's really going to affect their ability to do the work. And so I have to ask about that. But also I have to give them some tools to be able to start shifting and changing that. So things like, okay, let's talk about what you do before bed. Like, what is your routine? What's your routine when you go to sleep? And most people don't have a routine. They might watch television and go straight to sleep. And there's no ritual, there's no routine that they have where their brain gets used to being able to, hey, we do this first, and then we do this, and then we do this. And so it becomes more automatic once someone is practicing that. And there's a calming nature to it too. And it trains the brain to be like, okay, this is the time to sleep. And so if an individual might be experiencing difficulties with nightmares, I might also have them have a notebook by their bed and something they can simply jot down in some way, so that the goal is for them to go back to sleep and to not kind of continue to be disrupted. So they kind of practice that, and I'm checking in with them about that. Like, how are you practicing this in everyday life? What are your roadblocks to? And they might be like, I tried it once and it doesn't work. Okay, let's talk about what didn't work with it. Okay, let's, what can you change about that? If you don't like doing this, what can we put in instead that you can practice? And normally they're able to come up with things that they can do that are going to be self-soothing and that will, again, create that just normal pattern and structure. Breathing exercises, again, pretty basic, but highly effective. I tell clients, like, you can breathe anywhere. No one knows that you're doing it. They're not thinking about that it's weird. Like, you can practice that anywhere. And it also serves the purpose of getting them back into their body, getting them back into that state of awareness of being grounded in their body and being able to have that release and that control. Things like progressive muscle relaxations also work with this. Sensory tools that can help the client be in the present and ground themselves. I have typically in my career worked with a lot of dissociative clients. And so I've gained some skills along the way about helping them really kind of be in the present moment. How can I both have one foot in the present and one foot in the past while I'm doing the work, but have the means to actually be able to soothe myself so that it's not dysregulating. So the work is not something that is being done to me, but I have the ability to modulate it when needed. So, you know, very simple things that they can do anywhere. They can feel things around them, obviously, the different textures, different temperatures of things. If they're in my office, I have a pretty colorful office. And so normally they can look at things that are around. They can describe the colors that they see. You know, some clients have really taken to other sensory things like perfumes or lotions. They may have something, an essential oil that they really like that they might put in something either on their skin or in a little bag or something that they keep with them. And it just is soothing and it helps ground them in some way. So I want them to have the tools outside of my office, outside of the groups here, to be able to, okay, I'm feeling really dysregulated. Here's one tool that I can use with that. Here's one thing that calms and soothes me. And I really feel like during this stage that that's something that's important is helping clients give a name to what's going on emotionally. So one of the resources which I didn't include in here, one of the resources I use frequently in relapse prevention groups and in therapy is feeling wheel. Like they'll frequently tell me a thought. Or with eating disorder clients, they might say, I feel fat, and fat is not a feeling. So I'll get them to try and begin practicing. All right, here's a feeling wheel. It has all these variations of feelings. Like, give me a feeling. Like, let's practice you know, talking in group about this. Like, what are you just feeling today? Like, you don't have to go into any more than that, but what's this feeling that you're feeling? And then it helps them to be able to give voice to the feeling and describe it and label it so that they can then know how to respond to that. So abstinence. So abstinence. In abstinence, again, we're looking at tools for helping the individual to start shifting the behavior. We know that the individual may not fully be stopping the behavior at this point. It might still be up a little bit, but I want to start talking about it. I want to start helping the client to be able to establish a support network and identifying and utilizing supports. So support network. So whether we're doing this in terms of bringing the family members in or the supportive individuals in or helping the client to do that, I want them practicing it while they're in therapy, while they're in treatment at our facility. And so with that, I like to use the analogy of a fire extinguisher. So with the fire extinguisher, we really want to know the basic steps to use prior to being in the middle of a fire and really trying to figure it out. Like, my brain is not going to be functioning if there's a fire going on. And I've actually had the experience of being in the middle of the forest at a facility and having to learn to use a fire extinguisher, and it does not work well. So we want people to practice. We want them to actually be able to have some of these resources and be able to have something to turn to. So it might be like, all right, let's identify 3 people in your life that that you can call. And, oh, well, I don't want to bother them. I don't want to burden them. Or, well, let's have you do it when you're not in crisis. Like, well, what am I going to say if I like call them? Like, I say, tell them your therapist told you need to call and you need to practice and nothing's really going on. But, you know, if something is going on, could they be a support for you? And it sounds silly in some way, but it gets them prepared, because when something's going on, if I've never picked up a phone, if I'm not used to reaching out for support, then I'm not going to do it. It's going to feel foreign to me in a way that is going to shut it down. So I want them actively practicing that. All right, 3 times a week, I want you calling somebody to just say, hey, like, I'm calling you. So we're trying to replace some of the behaviors, or at least, again, like, get some abstinence. So if we're doing the work and you're engaging fully in certain behaviors, it's going to impact how fast or slower we can go, or if we can go at all. So if a client is chronically suicidal and every day we're having to focus in on their safety, we're not going to really be able to do the work because safety is priority. And so I might say that to an individual in a therapeutic way of, all right, is it something that maybe you need something more, or that we can't do this work right now, or what's coming up that we can problem solve a little bit? I had a client who, that was her language. The language was, here's my pain. And my pain comes out as, I want to kill myself. I don't want to be on the planet anymore. And so every time she would say that, she was a teenager, every time she would say that to individuals, they would freak out, rightfully so. And what would happen is it would be the opposite of what she was actually wanting. She was wanting people to hear her and to really kind of be able to interact with her in a way to help her figure out what's going on. But instead what happened is every time she had to go to the hospital, and then she wound up getting hospitalized, and people kind of withdrew from her in a way because they were so freaked out that she was suicidal. And so, it's also like talking about that language of, okay, it makes sense that you're, are you actually feeling that way, that you want to kill yourself? Or is this your language for, the pain is really bad right now and I really don't know what to do? And if it's the latter, that the pain is really bad and I don't know what to do, let's work on talking about the pain and what's going on with that, so you can actually get the help and the support that you need, excuse me, versus the response that you're not wanting. You don't want people to freak out because they withdraw from you. So again, we're really solidifying that support network, even if it's one person, even if it's a community meeting or a 12-step meeting or a church group, or just anything that's going to help them, again, start reconnecting with people to repair the rupture that trauma has caused. So identifying initial step points. I'm pretty continuously looking at this throughout treatment, but in the beginning, I kind of want to know, what are the fears around doing the work? Because there always are fears around doing the work. It helps us to be able to look at the fears because it informs me of where to go. It's like, where is this wound still? Like, what is still driving this? Like, we worked on this and we worked on this, but they're still doing this. And okay, what's the fear? And someone might say, like, for an eating disorder client, they might say, if I gain the weight and I'm not sick, no one will pay attention to me. That's been kind of the deal in my life. Like, people abandon me. And so when I'm sick, they rally around me. And, at least then I have connection if I'm sick. So it's like, okay, that makes sense, but how else can we help you get connection? So the step points and the fears really help us to understand where we should go. It also helps me understand, like, what could be some potential behaviors. If I have clients with substance abuse and eating disorders or self-harming, I know that those things are going to be popping up during this phase pretty heavily because it's protective in nature. And I'm trained in internal family systems, and internal family systems does a really good job of this, of really looking at what are the fears, what are the protectors involved that may flare up, what are the firefighters, as they're called. So a firefighter really just shows up and it's like, I'm going to shut down this crisis, like, by any means necessary. So if I've got a substance abuse client, like, that might be full on using behavior. If I've got an eating disorder client, it might be like those behaviors are going to be out the wazoo. If it's suicidality, that aspect of an individual wants to take them out. And so it helps inform where do I need to go? What are the potential pitfalls that are going to happen? Okay, so mutual agreement. I mean, this is pretty standard, I think, in therapy, but I really like to emphasize it in trauma resolution work, because frequently an individual who's experienced trauma has had things happening to them. And I want to make sure that we're in agreement about what our goals are. And sometimes an individual's not ready to go to certain places, and we may be able to work through that, or it may not be the right time. And either way, I'm okay with that. But I wanted a mutual agreement about the work that we're going to do, what to expect, what the goals are, and I open it up to the individual with a therapeutic relationship of, all right, let's talk about what's going well. Let's talk about what's not going well. If I'm doing something that overall isn't working, like we've been doing it a while, it's not working, you're not feeling XYZ, let's talk about it, bring it in. I like to invite them to do that from the very beginning, so that when things do come up, that foundation has already been established, that look, this is an okay thing to do, and it's actually valuable for me to know that. And I really actually do find it valuable, because if the client feels safe enough to say, hey, this isn't working, it's a compliment, it's a gift to the therapeutic relationship, if I can be in that place. And we'll talk about transference and countertransference, and how that kind of gets in the way. But I really look at that as a gift only. Okay, so assignments during this phase. So I've talked about some of these. One that we use in the facility that I also use in my individual practice, timeline. Timeline kind of just gives me, in the beginning, an overview of what the individual has been through and where they're going, and it also is important for what's missing. So if an individual doesn't talk a lot about relationships, if they skip over certain things that are apparent, like, it then gives me information of like, okay, maybe this is difficult, or maybe this is where they're stuck in some way, and so I'm looking for where are the holes in that as well. Again, like we talked about those grounding and containment skills. Containment box, I talked about some of the other ones here, but a containment box, I will do this both in session with the client as well as having them do it themselves. So both an internal visualization and an external exercise. So an internal visualization, there's some really good handouts on this. I talk about helping the client create an internal container, and you go through a meditation with them around that, of building this container that's big enough and strong enough for them in a way that makes sense. And just having that imagery. And then physically, I might have an individual have a container that they can put things in, whether it's a notebook, whether it's just a box, that things they want to talk about in therapy as a means of regulating if something is becoming really out of sorts for them, that they can write it down, draw it out, put it in the box, bring it into session, so that it gives them, again, that ability to be able to be in control of what's happening for them. We talked about the safe sleep routines, again, basics, foundation. Meditation, we use that frequently here. We have yoga and meditation groups. And in the beginning, all of our clients really, really don't like that, because again, it forces them to be in their body. And we're constantly helping them practice that. Like, all right, I know this group is hard for you, but I want you to go in and try it for 5 minutes. And then if after 5 minutes, you can come out. And mostly they don't. Like, they'll get more comfortable in the group. It's still distressing to be in their body. But again, they're learning these things to re-regulate what was ruptured with a trauma, and that's really vital. And so we want to help them be able to do that in whatever way possible. The function of the symptom, like I mentioned, with eating disorder clients, I will have them do that. I would also have the substance abuse clients do this, or really, as I'm trying to understand the function of the symptom, anyone, I'll have them write it, mostly draw it out. I like to use that other side of the brain, have them draw it out and talk about it in my session, talk about it in groups if they're in our program, so that we really increase the understanding of what's going on for them. Relapse prevention. I teach a lot of relapse prevention groups, so I talk a lot about relapse prevention. I'm using it a lot in my work. What I like really to do is as a behavioral chain analysis, and I adapt that somewhat, but we take the behavioral chain analysis and we diagram out the symptom and what's going on the board. I use big pieces of paper and we like diagram everything that's going out. And then we look at all of the patterns and things that are going on. And it's really an engaging process for the client. I normally have them do it in session, in group, like, all right. And then the group might comment on, what do you notice? What patterns are present? What do you notice about this? And some client may say, oh my gosh, like, no wonder I use my eating disorder. Like, everything that was going on in that day was completely dysregulating and I couldn't function. And so it seems like it happens automatically. Frequently clients will think that, like, well, this happened and then I binged and purged. And actually there's a lot that leads up to the symptom. And if I can help them understand the pattern, and if I understand the pattern, it gives us a place to really work on that and also interrupt some of the cycle that's going on with the symptoms in the stabilization phase. So we use a lot of CPT here, and there's a really good manual that I believe I listed in my references here. And it kind of takes you step by step through having the client work on various pieces, and the impact statement is a good one. And it's a more manualized way to do it, and that really works for some clients. And you can also weave it into different things that you might be doing at the time. Okay, so the next stage, integration, processing of trauma. So during this stage, pacing really continues to be important. Again, it creates this safety net, and I like the idea of a safety net for a client. It continues to provide safety. Like we talked about in the beginning, fear constricts and safety expands. So the more safety that we build into the work, the more the client is going to be able to feel like they can do the work, and that they have some control over how fast or slow it goes, or that it's a process that they're doing that is not just being done to them. So during this stage, the individual's talking and processing more of what happened or the trauma. This can frequently feel terrifying and overwhelming, as it also brings with it feelings, memories, and sensations the individual may have previously avoided. The individual may also get additional information about what happened. So I use eating disorders a lot because they're one of the populations that I frequently work with. And I see this very clearly with eating disorder clients at this stage. They typically want to avoid being in their body in whatever way is possible. And they typically are experts at being able to not have feelings and to shut them down pretty rapidly if they do, by means of control of the food, or compulsive exercise, or various other eating disorder behaviors. And so really important to like understand what's going on during this stage, and to bring in that pacing. Like, again, this is going to be vastly important to understand, all right, how do we pace things? Like, what's good, what's bad, what is tripping the person up? So, okay. So let's talk about the goals that happen in this stage. I really see this as understanding the context of a person's life. So if I can understand the context of what happened for the individual and how it laid the groundwork for that resilience or not, then I really can understand, all right, how did this seed get planted, and why did it turn into this plant when it came up? And so I want to understand their life first and foremost. What was it like growing up in their household? Good, bad, and different. Who was in their household? So again, this goes back to some of your history. What were the core beliefs that were present? So during this time, individuals would talk about like maybe what they learned, like perfectionism. So perfectionism contributes a lot to shame. And so if I learned that I had to be perfect, or I had to do things perfectly, or that an A wasn't good enough and it had to be an A plus, that's probably going to be one of my core beliefs. That's probably going to be how I operate in the world. So I want to be looking at what are the overt and the covert messages that were also going on. I want to be looking at what's their concept of themselves. Who do they see themselves as? What is going on with their sexuality? What is going on with their identity? How did this actually develop for them? So again, history. How does what happened feed into current symptoms, and how might the trauma block the client? So if I'm understanding, look, like if they had this really dysfunctional childhood and they never really learned to organize things, then they don't feel prepared to be an adult. And then trauma happened on top of that. They might have some skill deficits. And so we see this pretty frequently here at the facility. Individuals don't know how to do certain things. So they'll have trouble in the workforce, like getting a job, because they don't know the basics of being able to interact or interview. They may not know very basic things, how to cook a meal for yourself, how to do your own laundry. And we see this at varying ages, not just kind of adolescents or early adults. And so I want to understand, what blocks might there be? We have clients who struggle with social anxiety, and the social anxiety, if the individual has not had those social experiences and yet they are really struggling in relationships right now, they don't have the basic foundational things. And so I really want to know how that's impacting them. And so if they isolate, like because they don't know these skills, that would be a normative response. I don't know how to do this, so I'm going to avoid it. And so I want to help them understand where that originally came from. And then we want to work on it, obviously, as you're working through this. So schemas. Again, some good resources on schema therapy, but always looking at the belief systems. What's their worldview, and how does this manifest in their life? What sense have they previously made of things in the context of the trauma? So what are their beliefs about themselves? Like, what are their beliefs spiritually? Do I believe that God is bad because of what happened to me? Do I believe that I'm bad because of what happened to me? So constantly looking at what sense have they made of this. So then assignments in this stage, and again, not all inclusive, just some ones that I've found useful. So writing about the beliefs. So you might give them some prompts. So women are, men are, children are, families are, and you just have them free write with it. And it's actually really interesting what comes up out of this for individuals. Sometimes it would be something that comes up that you may not have gotten any other way. So they're talking to you about it in session, as well as if they are a part of a program, our program, they talk about it in group. And it actually provides a lot of help with shame, because they might say, women are bad, women are weak. And if they say that in a group or to someone who doesn't have those beliefs, they might be curious and they might say, well, why do you think that? And it helps them understand the context really about why do they believe what they believe. And it helps us to work through it as a start point as well. I like to do an exercise with them. And it's kind of a 3-part exercise where I have them draw out the problem. So the first part of the exercise would be, all right, let's draw out what the problem looks like. Whatever sense you have of that, what does that look like? So they maybe have 3 pieces of paper. The first piece of paper, they draw out what the problem looks like. And then as a second step, I have them draw out, what would it look like if the problem were solved? And so different piece of paper, they draw out what it looks like that the problem's solved. If everything were good, the problem was solved, how would it look? How would it feel? And then the third piece of paper is actually the middle. What keeps you from solving the problem? Where do you get stuck? What gets in the way of that? And then I might have them lay out those 3 pieces of paper and look at it and tell me, like, okay, I'll do this in groups as well as individual. Tell me what comes up. What do you see? And then I'd be like, wow, like, the problem and the solution to the problem are like opposite. And within the middle drawing that they sometimes do, the information's there. You get the stuck points, you get where their beliefs might still be. You get like some of the actual roadblocks, like it might be like relationally. I'm stuck in this situation with a partner or with a parent and I can't get out of that. So you get a lot of information in doing that. And then I have them, talk about it, write about it, and share it in some way. Again, the CPT for trauma is also important. And again, it kind of gives you this manualized way. I am trained in EMDR. I use EMDR pretty frequently. So we're also looking at the negative beliefs and stuck points. EMDR does a really nice job of that. Continuing to look at how the symptom works and serves the individual. Again, behavioral chain analysis, diagramming it out. And there are different names for this. I term it a me box. And so with a me box, it also gives us like some things about the individual. So on the inside of the box or container, whatever it is, it might be that they are drawing, what do they feel like? You know, what do they feel like? What's going on internally for them? And they put that in the inside of the container or the box. And then on the outside of the box, they're putting, how do they present to the world? And what do they show the world? Or what does the outside world see? And normally with those two things, they are drastically different. And you can see like, all right, here's where the stuck points are. Here's where an individual may have difficulty. So last stage, integration, meaning making. So this is an important stage, as you're really also seeing where the individual continues to operate from their belief systems or from the aftermath of the trauma. So during this stage, the individual is working on what meaning and beliefs they took on as a result of the trauma they experienced. This means looking at core beliefs they may have as a result of the trauma or about themselves. It may include more integration of injured parts of self that the individual may have previously disowned. And again, really good concept with internal family systems. With internal family systems, there's what are called exiled parts. And these are parts that an individual may have disowned of themselves. They might be feelings that they've disowned. They might be creative qualities that they've disowned. They might have disowned being creative or playful, and there may be more rigidity present. And so internal family systems, if you have the opportunity to read more about that or get trained in that, I would recommend that. It really helps and does a good job of looking at some of these things and helping to resolve it as well. Okay, so the goals in this stage. So the goals are really to be able to continue to understand the function of the symptoms. So hopefully by this stage, some of the symptoms have decreased. We want to see kind of longer periods of abstinence. So if somebody comes in and they're binging and purging daily, every day, multiple times a day, I would hope that by this stage, maybe it's every other day, or maybe it's decreased to once a day. So I want to see some change in the symptoms, but I also want to understand what's going on with why that might not have changed. What am I not hitting on, or where is the individual still stuck that we haven't gotten to yet, or something in the work may be bringing up for them. They're also beginning to restructure the event cognitively. So I'm looking at, you know, what's changed. They're looking at, sometimes it's monumental for them. They're like, wow, I used to feel this way. I used to feel like a bad, wrong, defective human being about everything. If somebody cut me off in traffic, it was because I was an awful human being. And now, I don't feel that way every day. So they're really restructuring beliefs, and they're also restructuring the meaning of the event. Attribution of blame. I really see this as, you know, kind of putting things into context and where they go. So if someone hurts me in some way, physically, verbally, sexually, in an abusive way, it has an impact on me. And I may never have the opportunity to confront that person. That may not be necessary to confront that person, but I still want to look at the impact that it had on me and what might have gotten taken from me because of that. And so I'm really looking at, you know, is the individual still blaming themselves at this stage? Or is it something that they're actually looking at, no, this wasn't my fault. Like, there was nothing I could have done in this situation, and yet it still happened. They're also increasing their capacity for healthy attachment. And again, like, people are the solution for this. And so they're actively rebuilding relationships, maybe forming new relationships, maybe like trying on different things that they haven't tried on before relationally, where they might have friends, whereas they previously have not, and it might feel foreign to them, but they're really practicing and working at this. So it gives us the opportunity to look at relationship patterns in the ways that they're interacting with both themselves and others. With this decreasing shame and alienation, again, I feel like this is also really, really important. And again, might seem self-explanatory, but frequently there's not a focus on the shame that an individual feels or how that separated them from other people. And so I think it's vital to understanding how the individual continues the damage that happened. If someone were verbally abusive and told me that I was a worthless human being, and I still tell myself that, it continues the damage, and it makes the damage deeper and deeper and deeper. And by looking at it, you begin to really kind of break it down brick by brick. I had a client who described their shame as this brick wall that they put up one brick at a time, with every hurt, with every rejection, with everything that happened, and that it became this barrier from them and other people. And so what we're really doing when we're looking at shame and alienation is we're really taking it down brick by brick. All right, this brick is really about this, and this brick is really about this. And there are a lot of really good resources. I listed some in the bibliotherapy around shame and like understanding how that came to be. And I find it invaluable to give clients readings on that and for us to discuss it. Like, okay, what do you relate to with this? They're talking about how there's this transmission of shame. How did that play out in your family, or did it? And what do you see about that? And I'm looking at that, and that's actually been really useful in the work with that. So assignments or techniques at this stage, real world practice. I'm always wanting clients to go out, practice this in some way, have some experience with it, and bring it back in and talk about what went really well and what was really difficult, actually. So you might see this in the form of exposures. So if I have individuals with PTSD trauma, we might do some very small exposures of, all right, if you fear people in this way, let's have you go out in a small area. So if I have difficulties with just being around people, I'm not going to like go into a stadium full of people because that would be terrifying. So we might start it off with like, all right, let's have you spend 5 or 10 minutes with a person, you know, and then, all right, maybe go to Starbucks or something and spend a little bit of time up there, and then maybe interact. And so you're building their mastery with being able to do that over time. At this stage, again, like I'm having them diagram out the problem. I love to have clients diagram things. They know that about me. I find it invaluable for them to see it, for me to see it. So I recommend it. If you don't like diagramming, don't do it. So again, like that 3-part process that I described before, they might be diagramming out their current behaviors or where they get stuck. Expressive therapies. So a lot of the art and drawing are expressive in nature themselves. And we actually do an expressive therapy group here that further helps individuals be able to draw things out, not literally draw things out, but to be able to actually put into the room what's going on and see that. And it's a very powerful tool to use to actually be able to look at in an external way what you're experiencing internally. So as I previously mentioned, internal family systems, what's called an unburdening in internal family systems, very great tool. The individual has kind of worked through these different stages. They've identified things, they've worked with internal parts of self, and then there's this beautiful unfolding phase of really helping those parts unburden things that they've carried both from the trauma from the past and being able to invite in qualities that they might want for themselves in the future. So again, if you have a chance to check that out, that's something that is extremely useful. So stuck points. So we talked a little bit about stuck points throughout this, and I thought it would be good to just overall identify in general what stuck points look like. So stuck points are not kind of these general categories. It might not be like, oh, I just, you know, feel X or Z way, like I feel mistrustful. Normally it's patterns, it's thoughts, ways of thinking that might get in the way of trauma. So if someone says, I feel mistrustful, we might look at that instead of them feeling mistrustful as trust issues. So their thoughts about people. So, oh, people are bad, like they always want something from you. There's always going to be a price to pay. Those would be some examples of stuck points. If I view the world as being a bad place and that there's always this transactional relationship with other human beings where something negative is going to happen, or I'm going to get harmed in some way, or I have to do something for something else. That's a stuck point. And it probably ties back to the trauma as we're looking at what contributed to it. They can often be an if-then statement. If then this happens, then this. If I accept help from my father, then there's going to be a price to pay. I'm going to have to, do something he wants to do, and I don't want to do that. So if then. Extreme language. This always happens. Like, people are always going to let you down. People never support you. That would be some examples of extreme language. And kind of two basic categories would be assimilated thoughts that are looking back on the past, and over-accommodated thoughts that are present and future oriented. So if somebody's worrying about what's going to happen in the future, their language, their thoughts is going to say this. And if somebody is really stuck somewhere in the past with a belief, again, their language is going to probably say that. So again, there's far more that goes along with stuck points, but that's just kind of just a general overview for stuck points. So transference and countertransference. So I find this to be invaluable in the work, and I really love this quote by Mark Groves that says, when you get reactive, get curious. You have a wound that is asking to be healed. And I find that so abundantly true with trauma survivors. They are constantly showing us and giving us detailed instructions of where the wound is, and we have to tune in. And if we don't, we miss a lot of things. And so it's always important to look at, as with any therapeutic relationship, transference and countertransference. And so we start by explaining a little bit of what this is. So transference, it's essentially what the client brings from their previous experience and projects onto the therapeutic relationship. It can occur in both positive and negative ways. We originally saw this with Freud and his thoughts on neurosis, and that this was a function of the repression of unacceptable ideas and impulses that the client would resist and push down, and that these would emerge on the therapist because that was a safer place for them to emerge. And then countertransference. So it's what the therapist brings into the therapeutic relationship that might project onto the client. And again, it occurs in both positive and negative ways. The therapist also brings things from their previous experiences and relationships. This might be personal. There might be things in our lives that are unresolved that could easily show up if we're not aware in the therapeutic relationship. It could be our previous therapeutic relationships. If we've had particularly difficult experiences, that can color our future therapeutic relationships. And so we want to, have that understanding and awareness of what's also what we're bringing into the therapeutic relationship. So what you have is this chart that talks a little bit about, from a client's perspective, what are some of the sources of positive and negative client responses to therapist. And so we have the stereotypical emotional response to socially defined attributes. So if they feel really positively, they might think that we're well dressed and educated. They might think we're authoritative, good looking. Negative. So this could be, they could, basically have a response towards men or women therapists. And so men are, women are, and there's that response that they have. They might think that the therapist is sloppy or foreign, or judge them on their weight or whatever it is. And that's kind of immediate response, that they have a negative response. And again, this might tie back into things that, let's say you had an older male figure in your life that was particularly authoritative, like you may withdraw from that. And so if the therapist comes across as that could actually be negative versus positive. So that would be an example of those. Situational, emotional response induced by the therapist's behavior. So if I'm yawning during session, which I try not to do ever, but if I'm yawning during session, then they might think that I am bored, that I really don't care about them. If for whatever reason I'm not looking directly at them for a moment, like they may judge that in some way that is some negative attribute, or positively. You know, they may say, look, like they feel positive in these ways. They might be, I feel they're attentive or warm or they're responsive to me. And that can be a good thing, but both of those things can equally have an impact on an individual. So alliance-based. So emotional response based on the state of the therapeutic alliance. And in the positive column, I like to think that some of this is good framework, but it can become where the therapist is also on the pedestal. So I trust and feel safe with the therapist. If I've worked with a therapist and I trust and feel safe with them, and I refuse to ever work with another therapist again, and like they can do no wrong, then that might be a difficulty. So that's where that could kind of get to be out of sorts. And so then we have the negative. And with the negative, the client doesn't feel contained or held or supported. I don't know where I stand. The therapist has their own agenda. They don't even really care about what I'm thinking. I don't even really know what I'm doing here. And then we have the transference based, a response that's based on the internal construction of the therapist rather than socially defined or actual qualities. So this therapist is very wise. They'll see me through anything. They'll never abandon me. And so if something happens, if I have to cancel a session, they don't care about me at all. Like they take great pleasure in like hurting me or humiliating me. They're bored with me. They don't really want to see me anymore. So it can kind of go back and forth. So it's important to know what some of the client's responses are as well as our own. And so then we talk just a little bit about some common types of countertransference. Again, what the therapist brings into the therapeutic relationship. Defensive countertransference, which is the most general type. It does occur when the client triggers the therapist's unresolved struggles. And these may be in areas of dependency or sexuality or aggression. You know, if I don't feel good enough or competent enough in some ways, a therapist, I might get defensive if a client questions something that we're doing. And so that's going to come out in the therapeutic relationship. Aim attachment countertransference, really about the therapist's motives. It is kind of our unconscious needs. So maybe, you know, again, with that incompetence example, maybe I don't feel good enough in some ways. And so I have to exert power or control wherever I can. And so any threat to that is not good. And it might also focus on what's lacking. So again, we know this to be dangerous when a therapist, you know, has unmet love needs that are getting played out in a therapeutic relationship, not appropriate, and causes a lot of difficulty. And if that need were getting met somewhere else, it might not enter into the relationship. And so we always have to kind of be working on that and aware of those things for ourselves. And some more kind of just overall types of transference. Transferential countertransference, where the therapist might respond as though the client is a parental figure or a sibling. They may have feelings of not being able to get through to the individual. So there might be a lot of feelings of frustration that occur at that point. Reactive countertransference, the therapist responds to the client's transference distortions as if they were real. And it might show up in a way that you're actually defending yourself or trying to explain, well, no, this is what really happened. And sometimes there's value in this, but again, it's somewhat the energy that it's delivered with. So if it's countertransference, I've got some energy behind it, and it's not therapeutic in nature. If it's not countertransference, like they might be things that I'm bringing up that I'm noticing in the therapeutic relationship, but I don't have that kind of block with it, if you will. Okay. And so then induced countertransference. The therapist might take up a role that was suggested by the client's transferential behavior. So if the client feels like you're not giving me enough, you're not doing enough, I might do more and more and more and more and more, which may not be appropriate. And it may involve things like giving advice or answering questions or giving reassurance or acting like a parent. And it takes you out of that role of being able to be more neutral with the individual. Okay. And so And then we have identification, countertransference. The therapist over-identifies with the client. They may enter into a covert alliance. They may be engaged in blaming others for the client's difficulties. So if my client is coming in and telling me about the difficulties that she's having with her husband, there might be an over-inclusive focus on, oh yeah, like he's the worst. Like he definitely is the reason why you're struggling in this way, versus looking at what the client might also bring to the table with this. Okay. Displaced countertransference. The therapist displaces feelings from their personal life onto the client. Their feelings towards one client may be displaced or acted out on another client. So if you have multiple clients, like one client may be the best client that you've worked on with, and the next client you may not be as excited to work with, and like, oh, I wish they were like this client, but you're not taking into account their unique or individual differences, or even what it brings up for you as an individual. The therapist might also displace feelings towards the client onto people in his or her personal life. So if I'm really frustrated and like feel really stuck with the client, maybe that shouldn't have been my personal relationships in a way that it shouldn't. So I'm displacing those feelings onto other people. Quote, all my clients seem to have the same problems at the moment. Sometimes, could that be true? Absolutely. Other times it might be that we're seeing things from a certain perspective and bringing certain things into the therapeutic relationship that make that appear so. Okay, so one of the tools that, that I really like for therapists, and you can also do this for other groups as well, is what is called the fire drill. And this is from Internal Family Systems, which I have referenced before. And it really helps you be able to practice being internally in self, and noticing what comes up for you. And I believe that I referenced it on my reference page there. But essentially, with this, you generally can do this with like 2 or more people, or you can even do it yourself. So I believe there's some resources that you can download with the actual kind of where it takes you through step by step on this. But basically, you have each person kind of deliberately think about something that is kind of medium level that bothers you. So you might do this as you're thinking about clients that activate you. So a client that activates you, you have them bring it up, and you have them notice what happens internally for them. And what the goal of this really is to look at what it's bringing up for you. And as you're looking at what it's bringing up for you, you're then able actually to respond to it. So I really find that to be a helpful kind of tool that you can use. Again, like I described previously, the 3-part imagining a problem solution and what the roadblock is, I use that really frequently, and I get a lot of information. I find it really useful. And then in the reference for Weiss, there's a Soothing a Triggered Exile, again, from Internal Family Systems, where it walks you through a meditation to be able to do with your clients. So those are some of the tools. Again, like I would refer to some of the references that are listed there for other ones. But again, I'll just see if there are any questions before we close. And if not, I'm guessing that we're closing.